Gentle readers, welcome to Everything is Everything. I'm Amit and this is my good friend Ajay. It's a beautiful day, Ajay. Isn't it a beautiful day?
It's a great day.
It's a great day, and some would say that the world is in crisis. Nature mein ye ho raha hai, government mein ye ho raha hai, state is doing this, etc., etc. But we say no, it's a beautiful day, but also the world is in crisis. And this episode is really about a common belief that comes out of crisis, especially in India. Because in India, we got some outstanding reforms done in 1991 when there was an economic crisis, and immediately people started parroting the conventional wisdom that, hey, you can only make great sweeping changes in a crisis, so a crisis ain't a bad thing. A crisis is a pretty good thing. But that, in a sense, is doing two things. It is mistaking correlation for causation in one way, and in another way, it is committing the selection bias, that you're looking at one particular crisis and good things that happened then, and you're not looking at what crisis in general can do, and they can be quite disastrous. And today, you're going to help us bust the myths that form that conventional thinking.
Let's go.
So, Ajay, there are people who say that a crisis is a great thing. It is an opportunity to make sweeping changes. You disagree, but before you come to your disagreement, I want you to steelman the position. Why is a crisis a good thing according to those who say it is?
Yeah. So there's a beautiful, famous quote by Rahm Emanuel, who I think was chief of staff for Barack Obama. He says, "A crisis is a terrible thing to waste." Okay, which is a riff on the mind is a terrible thing to waste. And similarly, many other people have argued that there's something special, there's something unique, that only in a crisis can you break the lock of special interests upon the way the world works. Here is a behavioral psychology way to think about it. Let's locate ourselves in prospect theory, and the behavioral psychologists would tell us that normally humans' baseline on their world around the world is fine. Then you don't want to take the risk of rocking the boat because we have loss aversion. Okay. Whereas in a crisis, it appears that the world is going to hell anyway. Now you're more willing to look at new things. So it seems that normally the political economy will be locked, there will be special interests, there'll be the tyranny of the status quo, and we will be unable to move progress. And there is merit in all that. There is merit in all this discomfort. And so let me show you another example. You, of course, talked about the 1991 crisis, which is a singular Indian success story, that out of the balance of payments crisis was forged an IMF program, which put India on the path to progress. We are very grateful to the IMF and to all the people who contributed to it. Do you know who was a key person on the IMF side for the 1991 program?
Urjit Patel.
Yes.
See, my GK is in place.
Yeah, your GK is great.
Do you know who was. Okay, how do I say this? I was going to frame a question that led you to identifying another important person who happened to be a Varma, not related to me, but there was an A in Varma
Yeah,
who
Varma,
was
very
also
much.
critical. So you
Absolutely.
get good things done with Varmas in the mix.
Absolutely. No, N. Varma was core to that story. I want to take you back to the food crisis of India, starting from the 50s and 60s. In the 50s and 60s, the population growth rate in India was considerable. And by and large, the food system was not getting fixed. Many people knew many of the pieces that needed to be done, but they weren't getting done. And, that's life. Then came the incredible monster years of 1965 and 1966. The Kharif crop of 1965 failed and the Kharif crop of 1966 failed. So back to back, we had two bad harvests. And we were at the verge of mass starvation in India. And at that time, the United States bailed out India with their PL 480 program, which gave concessional aid in the form of food grain. So India was reduced to taking development assistance in the form of food. And that's a pretty terrible place to be. And that did help focus the mind. And then all credit to Indira Gandhi, C. Subramaniam. They thought through this new set of ideas of high yielding varieties, fertilizers, irrigation, a whole bunch of interventions that gave us the green revolution. And that made a huge difference to India. So these are stories, and there are many, many such stories. But our main argument today is that be scared of what you wish for, and crises have a way of going very, very bad. I want to say it in a little more analytical way right away. Gentle readers, you should know a phrase, the Overton window. The Overton window is the range of possibilities that are accepted in the common public discourse. What crises do is that they widen the Overton window, and you'd like to think that many good ideas are now taken from heretical to doable because the Overton window gets widened in a crisis. Well, many terrible ideas are also normalized when you have a crisis and the Overton window is widened. So you shouldn't be sure about which way this goes. And actually, in poor countries, in developing countries, this is even more dangerous than it is in mature democracies.
So I have made two efforts, humble efforts in my time at widening the Overton window. One has kind of failed. It's a work in progress. It's a long game. The other has totally succeeded. The failure, of course, is to widen the Overton window of freedom, that how much is kind of acceptable. And I think, like, for example, whenever I talk about tariffs, I say all tariffs should be zero, period. I'm a tariff absolutist. Whenever it comes to free speech, I'm a free speech absolutist. By taking the absolute position, you make other positions that are not so absolute sound relatively reasonable. So you play a part in widening the Overton window there. And in my case, it's not tactical or strategic. I really do believe in that absolute position, both free speech being absolute and tariffs should be zero. But, that's a long game. We don't know if we will succeed. But the game in which I have succeeded is the Overton window of length for podcasts. When I started The Seen and the Unseen, people thought a 1 hour episode was a deep dive. It's too long. Arey, 80 minutes kaun baat karega? And now that we have done a 10-hour episode, I have had one 12-hour episode, I've done a bunch of 8-hour episodes. Suddenly, 1 hour is not a deep dive anymore. Other people are having the courage to do 3 hours, 4 hours, etc., etc. And long may they flourish. So I give myself full credit for that, at least in India.
And even on flimsy, consumerist, mass market platforms like YouTube, we are pushing the limits of what is considered a show.
To be honest, we haven't actually succeeded on YouTube, but we keep going. We keep fighting the battle. Uh, do the right thing. Don't worry about the fruits of your action. The Bhagavad Gita meets Spike Lee. So, Ajay, what is your theory of change?
My theory of change is that before you get to action, such as in the immediate aftermath of a crisis, many things have to be in place ahead of time. Ideas have to be in place. People have to be in place. Okay. You and I have done the Everything is Everything episode, The Long Road to Change, where we talk about this policy pipeline. And a lot of those pieces have to be there, they have to be around. Otherwise, a crisis is fully wasted. So, this is the first piece that you've got to think about, that only when a country has really built the people, the community, the ideas that are upstream of the policymakers. Okay, this is absolutely key. So there are people who like to sit in front of a policymaker, say to the policymaker, "Sir, what do you think you would like to get done? We will help you to implement it." Okay, and that's a noble impulse. The policymakers are buying the services of a lot of consulting firms, and they're doing this work. But that's really not of essence. Okay, if hypothetically you took 1,000 good policymakers in India and implemented everything that they want as of today, I don't think it would really make a big difference to making India better. The problems are upstream. You need to change the ideas. You need to change the imagination. You need to build a cadre of people who are upstream of the policymakers. Then, in a crisis, you have the possibility that those documents are in place, the people are in place, the thinkers are in place. There should be meetings of important thinkers of the country saying, "Guys, we have a problem. What do you think we should do?" And then there should be enough novel thinking and a divergence from the present state of the art, and then we'll get progress. But if you don't have those upstream investments done ahead of time, then even in a crisis, you'll just have more of the same. If in a crisis, you're going to gather a huddle around establishment figures, you're not going to make progress. So the people who are running the shop are seldom going to say, "Guys, this house is on fire." It is people outside who see it more clearly. People inside are always defensive. I vividly remember there is a storied Indian economics bureaucrat who has been very good to me personally, who was an deep part of the balance of payments collapse and the fiscal disasters of the late 80s. And in the run up to the 1991 reforms, he was stubbornly unable to see that this is broken, because he was kind of playing for his own legacy and he was being defensive about his own actions and so on. So the people who are inside the pressure cooker in a time of crisis are least able to understand that there's a problem. They'd always like to paper it over, they'd like to look good. It is only people outside who can see things in novel ways. And if you're going to try to do things differently, it's going to come from outside.
And a great illustration of that, of not just ideas spreading upstream, but actually happening within the system, really comes from what happened in India. Like, I used to think mistakenly of the 91 reforms as something that came about only because of the balance of payments crisis. And in that moment, they had no choice but to reform, but they didn't really want to. And the real story, as I have found out through multiple episodes of The Seen and the Unseen and Everything is Everything, which we'll all link from the show notes, is that it started much earlier. And it is in the context of that long story, that long arc, that Manmohan Singh is an even greater hero than one would think. Of course, he was finance minister in 91 and a prime minister later, and he did good work during UPA 1. But more than that, from the late 60s, he was building that community in silent ways, not just with the papers he wrote, but he asked Montek to come back to India in the late 1970s after meeting him in the 60s. He asked Vijay Kelkar to come back to India in the early 1970s, as you mentioned. He gathered a community of people around. It wasn't exactly an organized effort, but it was an effort at saying that let's people the ecosystem with interesting thinkers at various places. And from the late 1970s onwards, as detailed by Montek Singh Ahluwalia in his great Seen Unseen episode with me, there were a bunch of people in the background, many of them within government, thinking silently on what can we put in place to make the world a better place, to make India better. They were talking to each other. They were also working alone. They were picking their battles, not necessarily going all out and fighting a losing battle that could cost them their place, but they were getting the groundwork ready that if there is an opportunity, the ideas will be there, the policies will be there. I think in 1990, Montek came out with the famous M document, a work of legend, which contained much of the reforms we went on to do a year later. So when the 91 crisis happened, everything was in place. Everything, in a sense, had been put in place for the last 15, 20 years without the world knowing. And you knew what to do. You weren't floundering suddenly. That body of work was there. So that illustrates exactly what you're saying.
I think about it like the runner who carries the baton across the finish line. When we just look at that last clip of 10 seconds, we think, wow, you did it. Actually, the baton was handed by many earlier stages of the policy pipeline. So I feel we've got to see the policy pipeline in its entirety, and a country has to have that richness of the development of the ideas, the people. Then you have a ghost of a chance in a crisis when the status quo is indeed destabilized.
Take me ahead in the story.
The thinker John Kingdon has a conceptual framework which is different from and analogous to our theory of change, our long road to change EIE episode. He talks about it as three streams. There is a problem stream, there's a policy stream, and there is a politics stream. All the three have to come together to get a meaningful process of change. So the politics stream fell into place, the problem stream fell into place at the dawn of the 1991 crisis, which is really a late 80s balance of payments crisis. But that policy stream is equally important. You needed the thinkers who were upstream of the establishment. I cannot overstate this enough. These guys were not going and sitting with a joint secretary and being deferential. They were not doing government engagement. They were actually thinking in new ways. They didn't say that you have 300% tariffs. I'll build you a nice IT system to administer a 300% tariff. Okay, they were going after these things at a bigger level. They were doing intellectual leadership. They were thinking about how to do this right. It is grounded in political economy, in philosophy, in economics, in deep thinking. It is not consulting. Okay, it is not policy consulting. It is not practical work done for policymakers that gets you to new ideas and the broadening of the Overton window. So this is the way we should see it. Let me take a contrast, which is the opposite of this story. And I have told this story before in the Long Road to Change episode. This is the 2012 horrific Nirbhaya case where there was a rape in Delhi. That was a moment where the problem and the politics came together. And I know that Manmohan Singh and Montek at the time wanted to use that moment and make important progress on the reforms of the Indian criminal justice system. But the policy leg was not ready. We had not spent 20 years ahead of time investing in people, in documents, in books, in seminars, in conferences, in building the ideas and the knowledge and a whole interconnected world building of a new way of thinking with many moving parts, that this will interconnect with this, that if you do this, you will also need this. None of this can be hatched in a hurry. So because of that lack of investment in the policy stream for the 20 years leading up to 2012, a crisis is a terrible thing to waste, and the Nirbhaya crisis was wasted. We basically got nothing done out of that crisis other than some activist type lawmaking, which doesn't move the needle. At the time when the Nirbhaya case had happened, I had written a blog article which is titled "Activism and Wonkery Are the Yin and Yang." Okay, you need both. Meaning, if you're just going to go on the streets and scream about the Nirbhaya case or whatever else it is that is wrong about the world, yeah, that's important, it helps. But you also need the wonkery. You need fully articulated theoretical work, philosophical work, conceptual work. All real world systems have many moving parts. You need the people who have simulated that system in their mind and get it in an effortless way, that if I shift this, then this will also need to change. This will be an unintended consequence, that to do this you need this. This is the order in which these things should be done. If you don't have all that wonkery, then all the activism of the world is pointless. So I think that when modern internet and social media came along, many more people started participating in a certain notion of activism, which is to get onto social media and shout about something that they feel really bad about. And that has its place. But it's not sufficient. You need to think about the theory of change in a broader way. I also want to talk about the time frames involved. Vijay Kelkar, Arvind Modi, and I worked on a first fully articulated proposal for the GST back in 2003. So our report got done in 2003. And the first movement towards a complete GST happened in 2016. So it took 13 years. And that's okay. These ideas take time. To do important stuff takes time. So this quick and dirty notion that we want action orientation, we want to talk with a policymaker, we'll get something done the day after tomorrow. Again, I mean, I don't get excited. I think we'll do trivial stuff. Good work takes time. It takes knowledge, it takes philosophy, it takes philosophers, it takes thinkers, it takes papers, it takes books, it takes 500 seminars and conferences to argue about the GST. Then the country is spiritually ready to get to a GST.
Dear readers, at this point, I'd also ask you to check out Ajay's organization website, XKDR Forum, where this is basically what you do at XKDR. You are building that body of work, which in future can be plugged into at any point, whether it is, work at the intersections of law and economics and so on. So the body of work is there. So when the moment comes, when the politics and the problem come together, the policy will already be there. Gentle readers, are you Game of Thrones fans? Are you fans of the great line Chaos is a Ladder, which apparently comes from Game of Thrones, but before it came on Game of Thrones, our friend Ajay Shah wrote it independently in his book, In Service of the Republic, his fine book with Vijay Kelkar. And so he's kind of upset to find out later that, hey, it's also in Game of Thrones. And I'm like, it's such a great line, I came up with it. But, shit happens, man.
This is a concern about how crises work out. When crises work out, the Overton window is indeed enlarged. The checks and balances of society break down. People are more willing to accept something big. The normal norms that restrain power are less likely to work out. So we're actually in a far more dangerous place. And there is a certain kind of policy entrepreneur, very often a malign person, who can use that madness of a crisis environment to do very bad things. So we have to be very worried about what happens in a crisis. Contrary to that mainstream Indian view that only in a crisis will India reform, I actually want to say this upside down, that crises are truly dangerous times. In the best of times in India, we are not so great about checks and balances. You know, we are like an early stage fledgling democracy. We are learning basics. We don't even do separation of powers. We don't have the basics of liberal democracy in the country. We are an early stage. We are only 80 years old as a democracy. So, given the weakness of checks and balances, we've got to be far more concerned about what will happen in a crisis. Truly bad people will be able to run wild upon the country in a crisis. There is a philosopher named Carl Schmitt with two T's, who is famous as having been a philosopher that played a role in the emergence of the Nazis and some really bad authoritarian ideas in the world. He has a line which runs something like, the true ruler is one who is able to suspend rule of law in a crisis. Okay, and that straight away gives you a template for what we should be terrified about. So let's look back in world history and we can rattle off many examples of this kind of thing going bad. I think of the Indian emergency, which was the Justice Sinha ruling in 1975, as really being the continuation of a period. And so we've got to go back into history. The 1971 war was an enormous fiscal problem. And rapidly after that, the economy started deteriorating. In 1974, inflation reached 16%, which is the highest ever inflation in India's history. Inflation tears the society apart. Just everything goes wrong and people get unhinged. And then in that context, we had the JP Narayan movement, we had buses being burned, we had things falling apart. And yeah, Indira Gandhi was a true ruler who suspended rule of law in that time of crisis. Like, what a catastrophe. What a terrible outcome for the country. And I say, yeah, that's what you got to be terrified about. That we should be terrified of people like Indira Gandhi. We should be terrified of that prospect of suspending rule of law. And we should be terrified of crises that can bring these things together. Similarly, let's look back at Germany. After the First World War, Germany made huge mistakes about monetary policy and they got to a hyperinflation. A hyperinflation is a nightmare. It destroys polite society. It destroys the foundations of everybody's life. For you and me, if we have a hyperinflation in India, your life will be destroyed, my life will be destroyed. A hyperinflation is a catastrophe. So that was like stage one of the destruction of German society by bad monetary policy. Okay, so you should hold monetary economists responsible for all the good things in the world that have happened ever since we got to inflation targeting, and also for all the terrible things in the world that have happened because of things like hyperinflation before, or that 16% inflation in India in 1974. We should lay that at the doorstep of bad monetary economists.
We should lay that at the doorstep of the bad leaders at the time who overruled the monetary economists.
All these things. So think about it, that you want the true ruler who grabs power at the time of a crisis. We have to see that complex coming together. And then we got to Hitler's seizing power in an environment where the Communist Party was promising an armed revolution and the centrists were destroyed. The beautiful poem, "The Center Does Not Hold," is the essence of what went wrong in Germany in that period, and more than a passing resemblance in today's world where there are crazies on both sides and the center is being squeezed out. And then finally, you got to an event, which was the Reichstag fire. And Hitler used that event and monopolized power, suspended the constitution. That was a true ruler who grabbed that moment. And that was the greatest horrible moment you could think of for Germany, for the world. And it came out of a crisis. So we should think twice before we ever think that crises are nice things and somehow, inside a crisis, you will get good things coming out of that. That's not a given. You should be very, very concerned. Similarly, I think after the 9/11 attacks, there was a hawkish piece of the United States national security establishment which had been nursing some ugly authoritarian things for a long time. They had been nurturing the Patriot Act, the countering the financing of terror, the anti-money laundering, the FATF, which in India is the Prevention of Money Laundering Act, the Enforcement Directorate. We have an EIE episode on KYC. All that nonsense was being hatched in a crazy authoritarian piece of the United States establishment. And under normal circumstances, a lot of it would not have got through because there would be checks and balances. These things would be debated between lawmakers, and there would be enough principled political economy philosophers in the United States Senate and the House of Representatives who would say, what is this? This is authoritarianism. We're not going to do it. So all those things had been developed and thought about ahead of time. And then came the 9/11 attacks, and like whoosh, within weeks, all this stuff got through. And by and large, I'd say every piece of it was a bad idea. This was not a proportionate response to the events after 9/11. And the quick summary that we talked about in our KYC episode is that tracing money flows has never in world history disrupted any terrorist plot. All it has done is created a mass surveillance system in finance, and it has given the state a comprehensive ability to snoop on all of us. How is this a good thing?
You mentioned Carl Schmitt. Carl Schmitt also famously said that politics requires the other. And this brings me back to crisis, because one common response to a crisis, especially in India, is that you immediately invoke an other. And we leave it to your imagination, gentle readers, to think about events in India over the last few decades. But that is really the easiest thing to do in politics. You invoke an other, which could be, another community, or it could be the elites, as we discussed in our populism episode. But you always make a case of black and white, create imaginary enemies, go after the imaginary enemies, make yourself out to be the victim of something devious, even if you're in a far stronger position than those who you claim to be your enemies. So it's almost as if, on the one hand, authoritarians will use a crisis to enhance their power, as you pointed out, and at the same time, they will often use such rhetoric to create a crisis which they can then take advantage of to justify having more power.
When I was young, I used to watch this nonsense of Indira Gandhi talking about hoarders and speculators, and the reason for that 74 inflation was because there were these bad people who were hoarding goods, and it is their fault that prices were going up. And when I was a child, I used to think, come on, supply and demand is basic. Like, as a child, I knew about supply and demand, that prices are made by supply and demand. It is not made by some hoarders and
Your
speculators.
8th birthday was on 7th August 1974, am I right?
Yes. So I was like fully in the know by that time. Like supply and demand was something, that every child knew. So why was Indira Gandhi so clueless? And she had received all those beautiful letters, glimpses of world history. So she must be a very smart person. I used to be genuinely baffled. When I grew up, I understood this is populism. You want to stoke hatred against the elites. And so rich people, the traders, the hoarders, they are the source of the inflation. It's not my fault. It's not that I messed up monetary policy. It is the othering. And then you create conditions for the hatred of the elite, which is turned into a full-blown Garibi Hatao populist ideology. So you get this whole us and them, that you have to hate the elites, and we will use state power to hit at people. We will go after things like privy purses and so on.
So, on the lines of glimpses of world history, I have the title of a book that you should write.
Okay, do tell.
Glimpses of Good Economics.
Glimpses of good economics. Okay. I'll write letters to Ponyo.
Ajay, I love your beard, but I want to gift you a razor. You have, of course, heard of Hanlon's razor, right? Hanlon's razor is never attribute to malice what can be adequately explained by stupidity. Now, we have spoken about how chaos can be a ladder for malice, but at the same time, a lot of states are simply weak. When a crisis comes, they do all the wrong things not because they are evil, but because they are incompetent.
So one pathway through which a crisis turns into terrible outcomes is through malice. In the case of the malice line of attack, the leader does more when, in a weak state, you have fewer checks and balances. Okay. Now there are shades of gray. So Hitler faced certain checks and balances and destroyed the Weimar Republic. And I think all of us will agree that the Weimar Republic was an early stage democracy. They were still figuring out how to do basics. They just come out of imperial Wilhelmine rule, and they were figuring out how to be a democracy. Okay, whereas when you get to the Patriot Act and countering the financing of terror, the United States was a better democracy, so the depredations of that period were relatively limited. There's a great story that Jim Comey tells about one of the mass surveillance programs where it involved individuals, namely him, who was at the top of the United States national security establishment, desperately, urgently getting into a car, rushing to a hospital to get to one desperately ill person and to brief them before something bad was about to be done about a mass surveillance program. Okay, that is checks and balances. You need those people. You need those amazing people who will stand up and fight for rule of law, but you need those checks and balances. Whereas in a weak country, in a fledgling liberal democracy, you will just not have those checks and balances. Powerful people will do really bad things, and most of us will just, bow our heads in shame and go along. We will not do that desperate car dash across the city trying to get to a hospital, trying to brief one critical person who occupies a certain seat of power, who was in the hospital at the time, about precisely what was sought to be done at that moment as a mass surveillance system. So that's a pathway through which weak institutions creates less checks and balances and gives you bad outcomes in a crisis on the line of thought of malice. But now let's think about incompetence. When you have a country with weak institutions and it is presented with a crisis, now you have frail people. Okay, government is the power of giants given to pygmies who are trying to respond on a day-to-day basis on a crisis, and they just do weird things, wrong things, bad things, make a crisis worse. Okay, and this is equally a source of trouble because first of all you have a crisis, and then you've just got men and nations floundering around, making mistakes, making it worse, which may not necessarily lead to a long-term disaster. It's not a Reichstag fire situation, but it is a tale of woe and misery. So in this, I want to take you to some examples. Consider RBI in the period after demonetization. RBI released 74 regulations in the 50 days after demonetization. Okay, so just think, they were on a desperate process of trying to figure out one thing after another on the fly. There had been no planning. They didn't know what was going to happen. And you got 74 different regulations in 50 days. It just served to make things worse. So you took a bad situation and made it worse. And my claim would be that better state capacity would have delivered a better planned demonetization, meaning not that I support demonetization, but if you had to do it, think more.
I mean, a more competent state would never have done something so
That too.
daft and idiotic as remonetization.
Yeah, that too. Okay. On a similar note, the Ministry of Health released 1,324 press releases at the time of COVID. Okay, now, like, what sense does that make? This was clearly an institution that was overwhelmed. To use the terminology of Lan Pritchett, this is an organization which faced a high loading. So there was a premature load-bearing problem, and the organization collapsed into an organizational rout, and we just got chaos.
Ajay, we have a crisis. It's going to rain. Let's continue after the rains are done.
Without an organizational route.
Without an organizational route, we shall continue. Gentle readers, as our good friend Oblix would say, the sky fell on our heads. It was a little bit of a crisis, but Ajay and I have come indoors. I have been reacquainted with my comfort bear, Freddy, named after Bastiat and Hayek, so fantastically comforting indeed. And Ajay, to my relief, did not throw a tantrum on the subject of tantrums.
In continuation of where we were, I want to talk about the 2013 so-called taper tantrum. Okay, so Ben Bernanke made some remarks to a journalist, and the whole world got worried, and there were great fluctuations in financial markets all over the world. And that's an example of a crisis where the difficulties and weaknesses of the Indian policy frameworks and policy institutions made things bad. So I wish we had handled things better. We didn't. And the combination of RBI and Ministry of Finance just failed to understand that situation, and many mistakes were made. And it converted a medium problem into a much bigger problem. We got a big mess out of policy mistakes.
So, Ajay, how should we think about doing reforms then? What kind of mindset do you urge upon would-be reformers?
We should not expect crises to be central to the story of progress. We should dread a crisis, and we should make progress every day. A good country is one where you make progress every day. And that progress comes out of incrementalism. It comes out of that policy pipeline that we've talked about, our core theory of change, that you need a community of thinkers who are able to dispassionately look at the world, criticize the status quo, come up with new ideas. Gradually, those ideas become mainstream. They percolate to policymakers, and then policymakers will do implementations. They will use their own teams and they will get their things done. And slowly, we'll make progress. So, it's an incrementalist vision of progress rather than some big bang vision of progress. The great philosopher Karl Popper talks about a distinction between utopian social engineering versus incremental social engineering, where utopian social engineering is this scary thing where somebody comes up with a grand scheme and we're going to fix the world. We will do collectivization of all the farms of the USSR, and these things generally take you to a terrible mess. So we should be very mistrustful of grand schemes. We should be very mistrustful of utopian ideas, of utopian social engineering, where somebody wants to do a big bang and change the world in a deeper way. That seldom works well. You and I have a shared conservative philosophy in this, conservative as in Edmund Burke, that we're skeptical about big moves. We're skeptical about grand schemes. The world is complex. It's a statement of humility. We don't understand the world a whole lot. Let's chip away, making one change at a time in a humble approach where we are happy to accept that we were wrong and reverse course. So we should make mistakes. We should keep on chipping away. SAD is a country that needs a hero. SAD is a country that needs a crisis. And as you know well, the essence of this debate is the distinction between the French Revolution, which was a comprehensive tearing down of society and destroying the lives of millions of people, versus the way the British did it. So the British equally got out of a monarchy into a beautiful liberal democracy, but they did it incrementally. There was only one critical milestone where the Republicans, led by Cromwell, cut off the head of Charles I. But there was never a revolution. They never tore up the society, and they chipped away. Gradually, the power of the parliament was expanded, and gradually Britain became a great liberal democracy, and it became the most successful country in the world. And in a way, the very success of Britain reminds us of the value and the power of that incrementalism. Whereas when we think of something like a French Revolution, it's a dreadful event. It actually put France back for many, many years. And, it was an enormous time before France could find its feet again. And in a way, many, many things went wrong in France because of the French Revolution. So that wholesale tearing down of a hated social order, every radical's dream, the utopian social engineering, this is really harmful. Nobody should aspire to it. And as an example of slow incremental progress, I lived through the early years of the reforms of the Indian equity market. By and large, from 1992 till about 2007, okay, a whole lot of things got done. It was a collaboration between folks in the Ministry of Finance, at SEBI, at NSE, in academics. There was a continuous process of feedback, of data, of research, and many, many, many moves. And over that period, one of the greatest things for India got done, which was to get to a good equity market.
And gentle readers, two recommendations here. One is one is my Seen Unseen episode with Ajay Shah, 10.5 hours, where this particular journey is described in great detail of those 92 to 2007 of those years. And the other is our AIE episode on labels, where we speak about conservatism and Burke and what the kind of conservatism we subscribe to is not the one that says that don't change the world. I think both of us are liberal in our ends, conservative in our means, recognizing that the world is deeply complex and you got to change one step at a time because everything sets off unintended consequences and domino effects and you have no control over that. So you need to tread carefully. If you act too fast, the danger is you're going to break a lot of things and you're not going to know what happened.
So I want to sum up and take us to the big ideas. When a crisis takes place, if that preparatory work had not been done, the papers, the people, without that policy, intellectual development of the ideas, then a crisis is useless. You'll get nothing. Okay. When a crisis takes place in a fragile state, you run the risk of authoritarianism. So the autocrats, the policy entrepreneurs in the spirit of Carl Schmitt will stand up and say, I'm your true ruler, and suspend rule of law and take you to terrible outcomes. When a crisis takes place in the hands of a weak state with low state capability, you will get a flailing state, you will get 100 incoherent policy measures. Again, the word incoherent. Coherence is an intellectual's word. It is a philosopher's word. It is about understanding the world and finding a common strategy that is then applied to disparate problems. Whereas when you have a weak state, when there is low state capability, when there is low intellectualism, then they are practical people. They're just doing execution. Every practical problem is seen in an expedient way. You want to solve that problem without thinking about the larger picture. So we get a large number of incoherent actions which actually make a mess with each other. That's like our story around demonetization or pandemic or the 2013 taper tantrum, where just a bunch of mistakes are made because the basic concepts and principles were flawed. So this is a rough taxonomy about how crises make things wrong. How are we to make progress? What is to be done? What is to be done is for the reformer to stay committed to the project of making the world a better place in peacetime, not to wait for a crisis, not to engineer a crisis, but to ask for the highest hope that fix the roof when the sun is shining. Don't wait for the storm to fix the roof. So fix the roof while the sun is shining. Build the community, build the people, chip away, be a bricklayer, put one brick at a time of incremental progress. In a spirit of humility, twice. We must be humble because we don't understand the world. And so we should not be so arrogant as to do a big thing. We should not have grand schemes. We should not do utopian social engineering. We should never do a French Revolution because that's too much arrogance. You pretend to know the world. Okay. None of us know the world. And the second time, because we should always be ready to accept mistakes, to accept that we were wrong. So we are bricklayers. We'll put up one brick. It didn't work. It didn't feel correct. The data, the evidence showed that this stuff wasn't working. And then we should be humble enough to say, okay, I was wrong. Now let's go forward. So that's the correct spirit in which we make progress. A great country is one that makes progress without requiring a crisis. And you should chip away all the time. We should make progress all the time.
So I want to bring this to the realm of the personal, and I'll build a metaphor which is a flawed metaphor. I'll explain why it's a flawed metaphor at the end. But I think that it also works and it has some great wisdom within it in the same direction. Let us think of the personal. Let us think of how we deal with crisis in our own life, right? You could say, right, oh, Amit, you had a crisis with your heart earlier this year. You got a stent put in that led you to sort of make changes in your lifestyle. All of that was for the good. So There was a crisis, you did some reforms, right? And what I would say is that yes, a crisis can be an opportunity to give you a reality check and then you do some necessary reforms. But a lot of the time, a crisis is a terrible thing. The crisis can kill you, as indeed I could have died. The crisis can, make you permanently worse off in different ways. The crisis can make you, say, reliant on medicalization over a period of time, though thankfully I have come out healthier and much better than before. That was my good fortune. A crisis can do all of those things. A crisis is not to be wished. And similarly, you could say that, hey, at one point I got diabetes, and then we have an episode on how I reversed it with diet and etc. etc. But should I have had to reverse it? Should I have gotten it in the first place? When I think of my life, I think that had I lived a healthy lifestyle, and I knew what a healthy lifestyle was, but I didn't have the discipline to live the healthy lifestyle. I didn't have the discipline to go out and exercise every day. I didn't have the discipline to do the resistance training. I didn't have the discipline to avoid sugar, to sleep properly. Had I lived that healthy lifestyle, the diabetes wouldn't have come, the heart issue would not have arisen, right? These crises happened because there were a lot of things that were wrong with our system. Yes, the 1991 balance of payments crisis helped us carry out reforms which we had planned for a long time. But had our policy ecosystem been healthy and vibrant, and had we done the right things before that, the crisis would never have occurred, and as a baseline we would have been much better off before. So my thinking there is that the way to think about this is that in our own lives also, it is important to not wait for a crisis or to wish upon a crisis, but instead to do all the right things, to live in a good way, so the crisis never comes upon us to begin with. That is one lesson I learned from this. The other lesson is that when a crisis does happen, it is far easier for us in our personal lives to do the good reforms than it is for a state. A state is deeply complex. There are all kinds of moving parts. There is politics, there is policy, there are all kinds of actors, all kinds of stakeholders. There are the bad incentives of electoral politics, of public choice theory. It's incredibly complicated. And a fast and hasty action in that moment is far more likely to go wrong for a state than it is for a person. If I have a heart ailment, or if I have diabetes, or God forbid, if something else happens tomorrow, I will pretty much know that, okay, these are the right things that I have to do. But for a state in a complex economy, in a complex society, it's really hard to do that. So you have to proceed with caution, and you have to begin planning in peace times. It is in peace times that you win the next war by making sure the next war doesn't happen. So that's sort of the personal lesson that I draw out of this, with the caution that the metaphor is flawed because individuals can react much better in a crisis than a state can.
Amit, the analogy is remarkable. It is very interesting to think about it that way. We shouldn't have come to the situation where you even had a heart attack. So that is like, can you get things right ahead of time? In similar fashion, through the 80s, India should have been doing better things so that there was never a balance of payments crisis in the late 80s. So that analogy is exactly correct. And then in a crisis, we get the divergence between the two worlds. When it is me, myself, there is no complexity of incentive alignment, of power struggles. But when we come to society, the response to a crisis is far more complicated. And so we have to be much more circumspect. And I hope all of us are able to take a personal crisis and generally turn it into important moments of reinvention where we come out stronger and better. Gentle reader, we are at the end of this episode. I want to read one quotation for you. This is from Max Weber. Politics is a strong and slow boring of hard boards. It takes both passion and perspective. Certainly, all historical experience confirms the truth that man would not have attained the possible unless time and again she had reached out for the impossible. But to do that, a man must be a leader, and not only a leader, but a hero as well, in a very sober sense of the word. And even those who are neither leaders nor heroes must arm themselves with that steadfastness of heart which can brave even the crumbling of all hopes. That is necessary right now, or else men will not be able to attain even that which is possible today.
And I saw you stumble once in the middle because you replaced a he with a she, because both of us are in the habit of always using the feminine pronoun as a default instead of the male pronoun. Weber lived in a different age, so what to do? That is the age where men were men. And on that warning note of the beeping we just heard, let us end the episode. Let us hope you enjoyed it, dear reader. Like, subscribe, share. Thank you.